Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Sallallahu wasallam wa barak ala Nabi Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So as always, we thank everyone for coming and making time in your Monday evening to join us. And inshallah ta'ala, tonight we'll be continuing our series in which we've been discussing how the shaitan practices his enmity against Adam and his progeny. And the past two segments we dedicated to contemplating one of the weapons of a shaitan, highlighted in the verse of Surah Al-Isra, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala he says, وَقُلْ لِعِبَادِي يَقُلُّ الَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ إِنَّ الشَّيْطَانَ يَنزَغُ بَيْنَهُمْ إِنَّ الشَّيْطَانَ كَانَ لِلْإِنسَانِ عَدُوًّا مُبِينًا. And say to my servants that they should only say that which is best, for indeed the devil sows discord amongst them. Indeed, Satan is to man a manifest enemy. And in those two segments, we spoke extensively about how the shaitan uses his knowledge of our tendency to err in our interpretation of ambiguous statements and actions. He uses this knowledge to destroy our relationships, especially those relationships which are particularly conducive to living a life that is pleasing to Allah. So when the shaitan identifies someone in your life that is helping you to get closer to Allah, the shaitan will try to drive a wedge between you and that person. And one of the ways that he will use, one of the weapons he will use to achieve this objective is to manipulate that tendency that we have to interpret people's ambiguous statements and their actions, to err when doing so. He'll manipulate that to his advantage. And so he'll use that to create that wedge to drive us apart. And that way he succeeds in taking someone out of our life who could help us to get to Al-Jannah, basically. So, as always, we like to recap the previous segment. And so I'll just do that ala ujala quickly by saying that those two segments in which we focused on that ayah from Surah Al-Isra, they taught us, among other things, that actors, the people who do those ambiguous or vague actions, or make those ambiguous or vague statements, the people who do that, they need to, one, consider carefully prior to and during any action. They have to consider how that action is likely to be perceived. So there's part of the onus is on the actor. That before we do anything, we think, okay, how are people, especially those people who matter to me, how are they going to perceive this action? And if they could possibly perceive it poorly, then we should take a different course or do things differently. And we see that from the Prophet ﷺ, and we gave the example last week of how the Prophet ﷺ, when he was, when it was suggested to him that he should kill the munafiqeen because they were causing so much trouble, and they themselves were a divisive force amongst the Muslims. And we mentioned the incident where they had actually tried to turn the muhajirin against the Ansar, and they were successful in that. And so when that was suggested to the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "La wallah, la yuhaddithu an-nas, or la yatahaddithu an-nas anna Muhammadan yaqtul ashaba." He said, "No, I'm not going to do that, because I'm not going to have the people saying that Muhammad kills his companions. I realize how this is going to be perceived." And so that prevented him from taking that course. And so we have to do the same thing. In these relationships, we have to think, look before we leap, and think about how our actions are going to be perceived, and in many cases, the problems that we have in our relationships. And we talked about this is the marital relationship, this is the relationship between brothers and friends, the relationship between siblings, the relationships community, we talked about Imam and community, Imam. All those relationships are impacted by the fact that sometimes the actor doesn't consider how their action might be perceived. And so we have to do that. The second thing we said, the actors, they need to do introspection. If they're doing actions and they do not have any malicious intent in those actions, but those actions continue to be perceived in a way which is negative, and at some point that person has to do some introspection and say, okay, is it me? Do I need to conduct myself differently so that my actions send a different message? Because somehow, some way, whether I intend it or don't intend it, whether it's inadvertent or purposeful, the message that these actions are sending is not the one that I intend. So maybe I need to change. And this is another problem too. Many of us are stubborn. And we think, okay, I'm just going to be me. I'm going to do me. And people should just accept me as I am. No, because the reality is that, as we said, actions have meaning. And the meanings that they convey to different people is determined by a lot of different factors, which we discussed extensively in the first segment. And so if they're interpreting our actions in that way, then at some point some of the onus has to be on us to kind of change the way we act so that people will interpret our actions in a different way. Then from Pt.7, we talked about the interpreters, people on the other side of that, and how they should do a few things. And one of them is they have to acknowledge that interpreting actions is difficult. And most of the time when we interpret actions, we do so erroneously, we err. And so if you interpret an action, you have to recognize that, yeah, I could be wrong. I could be interpreting this I could be totally off base. You have to acknowledge that. The second thing is you have to give people the benefit of the doubt if they deserve the benefit of the doubt. And we talked about the Aether, mentioned by a number of the early Muslims, in which they basically said that if you see something from your brother or sister in Islam which you disapprove of or which disturbs you, then make an excuse for them. Continue to make excuses, up to 70 excuses. And if you don't find a suitable excuse or excuse that makes sense to you, say, لَعَلَّ لَهُ عُذْرٌ لَا أَعْرِفُهُ. Perhaps he has an excuse which I don't know. I don't know what it is. And last but not least, we said that the interpreter has to do introspection. If you're constantly interpreting the actions of a certain person or certain people in a certain way, in a negative way, for example, and other people are not seeing it the way you're seeing it, and at some point you have to ask yourself and say, okay, do I have some biases toward this person? Also, if you're constantly giving someone the benefit of the doubt and other people are just not seeing that, you're the only one seeing the benefit of the doubt for this person, and maybe you have some biases in favor of that person. And you are interpreting favorably his actions because what? Because of that bias, etc. So do some introspection. And then last but not least, and this was the important thing that we continue to try to underscore last week, and we'll do that again today, is that communication is our greatest weapon. Our greatest anti-weapon to shaitan, in this case, is communication. So the shaitan is keen to destroy our relationships, and one of the best ways that we can prevent him from doing that is by communicating. Hey, you did this, and this is how I interpret it. So we communicate. That's not what I meant, so on and so forth. And if I'm feeling a certain type of way about something you did, I'm going to say, hey, this is how what you did made me feel, etc. And this communication, it's not always comfortable. And we have to be, if we love the people in our lives and those relationships mean something to us, then we have to make ourselves comfortable being uncomfortable. And have those uncomfortable conversations which can prevent the shaitan from ruining our relationships. And in conclusion on this point, I just want to say that all of this, it only works if the people involved truly listen. And this is one of the big problems with the Muslims, unfortunately, is that we don't like to listen, especially when we feel, even if our feeling is not accurate, if we feel that we're being criticized. We don't like to listen. If we feel that somebody is pointing out an area where there could be some improvement, we become defensive, we don't want to listen, and then what? There is no communication. And if there's no communication, then we have not defended ourselves. We've deprived ourselves of the ability to defend ourselves from the shaitan. And you see this all the time. I don't want to get into practical examples, but you get my point. But tonight, I wanted to contemplate and seek to derive lessons from an Aether, which has been collected by Al-Imam Al-Tabari rahimahullah ta'ala fi tafsiri, and Al-Qurtubi fi tafsiri, and Ibn Kathir in his commentary, and other commentators of the Quran have collected it as well. And this Aether has been reported on the authority of Ibn Mas'ud, Ibn Abbas, Tawus, Muqatil, and they've all mentioned this Aether in connection with their commentary on the verse from Surah Al-Hashr, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَمَثَلِ الشَّيْطَانِ إِذْ قَالَ لِلْإِنسَانِ كْفُرْ فَلَمَّا كَفَرَ قَالَ إِنِّي بَرِيءٌ مِنْكَ إِنِّي أَخَافُ اللَّهَ رَبَّ الْعَالَمِينَ. The likeness of those deceitful would-be allies. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the Jews from Bani Nadir, who promised another group of the Jews that if they were attacked or expelled from their homes by the Prophet and his companions, that they would join them and fight against them and protect them from being expelled. But they didn't. When it came time for those people to be expelled, those people who promised them they would be their allies did nothing. Allah says, كَمَثَلِ الشَّيْطَانِ. Their likeness is the likeness of Satan. When he says to man, disbelieve, and I will protect you. If you disbelieve, I'll have your back. This is what Shaitan says. But when the individual disbelieves, Satan abandons him. So he only does that to deceive him. And once he gets what he wants, Satan abandons him, saying, I absolve myself of any responsibility from what you have done and distance myself from you and your actions. I fear Allah, the Lord of the worlds. Just totally what? Leaves him in the lurch, totally treacherous and deceitful. So, in the commentary on this verse, the commentators have mentioned this Aether in which it says, a devout and faithful worshipper from the children of Israel used to worship Allah, and he would worship him well. He was very committed to worship. And he worshipped Allah beautifully. He worshipped Allah fervently. He was sought out by the people from every land, coming from far and wide, to ask him about fiqh, jurisprudence, and he was a highly competent scholar. So in addition to being very pious, he was a highly competent scholar. People would come from all over, far and wide, to ask him about the deen. In one version of Tabari, he says, وَأَنَّ الشَّيْطَانَ أَرَادَهُ أي أَرَادَ أَن يُغْوِيَهُ. So the shaitan, he's watching all of this play out, and so he targets him. He basically sets his sights on this man. He wants to lead this man astray. And there were 3 brothers who lived in the same village or near the village of this pious man, and those 3 brothers had a beautiful sister. And few people possessed the beauty she possessed. She was stricken with an illness and became so ill that she lost her attractive features and could scarcely fend for herself. So imagine that she was very beautiful, and all of a sudden she got ill, and for example, her hair fell out. Maybe her eyes sunk in. Her skin became very pale, and other things happened to her that made her unattractive. And not only that, she was bedridden and really couldn't fend for herself. She couldn't feed herself. She couldn't do basic things for herself. She was entirely dependent on her 3 brothers for her care. The brothers, they wanted to travel for jihad, but they worried that if they left their sister without a caretaker, she would perish due to neglect. With no one to look after her, couldn't feed herself, couldn't take care of herself, she would certainly perish. So they thought about what to do with her. One of them offered a suggestion saying, shall I tell you with whom you should entrust her? They said, yes, certainly, with whom? He said, with the devout worshipper and pious servant of God from the children of Israel. If she dies, he will take care of her funeral and burial arrangements. And if she lives, he will look after her until you return to him. I'm sorry, yeah, until you return to him, yes. So they went to him and they said, we want to travel for jihad, and we do not know of anyone more worthy of our trust or anyone who is more faithful in fulfilling the trust of matters entrusted to him than you. In Al-Qurtubi's version, he mentioned that initially the pious man refused. He said no. In fact, he said, A'udhu billahi minkum wa min ukhtikum. He said, I seek refuge in Allah from you and from your sister. So not only did he refuse, but he sought refuge in Allah from them and from their sister. But the brothers continued to insist until he finally agreed. So the brothers joined the deployment, and the pious man assumed the responsibility of caring for their sister. The devout worshipper nursed her back to health. She recovered and regained her strength, and her beauty returned as it was. In Al-Qurtubi's version, it is mentioned that the pious man continued to care for her, but did so while taking the most extreme precautions to avoid temptation. So Al-Qurtubi, he mentions, for example, that when she became healthy and she was no longer like bedridden, that the worshipper, he had this soma, he had this hermitage. And so what he would do is, he would make food, prepare food, he would bring it down, he would set it at the door of the hermitage, close the door, lock the door, ascend to the highest part of the hermitage and sit there and wait for her to come out and take the food. And he had other precautions that he would take so that he would not interact with her, he wouldn't see her, but he would take care of her in the way that he could while maintaining these precautions. But each time, Satan would come to him and whisper, encouraging him to lighten these restrictions and abandon these precautions under the pretext of doing good, seeking Allah's reward, avoiding something disproved or discouraged, or preventing some unfortunate occurrence. So the shaitan would come to him and tell him, look, you shouldn't do this. You should lighten these restrictions and you'll get more reward from Allah. Think of the reward you would get if you took the food to her door instead of leaving it at your door and making her walk. And if you make her walk, he would also make him think you're doing something wrong, and by not doing this precaution, you'll be doing something good. So for example, he would say to him, okay, if you leave the food at your door, she has to come out in the daytime and people will see her, and that's not a good thing. And if somebody sees her, some harm could come to her. Maybe somebody will accost her. So you shouldn't do that. So the shaitan, in the form of telling him, hey, don't do this precaution, because if you do so, you'll actually get more reward. Or if you do so, you'll do something discouraged or something displeasing to Allah, or expose her to some harm. So ultimately, the shaitan, he kept doing this until he had gradually gotten the man to abandon every precaution, and he found himself in the woman's home alone with her. The devil beautified her in his eyes, and he was overcome with desire and was intimate with her. The woman became pregnant from their relationship, and the devil came to the man and said, what are you going to do to get out of this predicament? What are you going to do now? Soon her maternity will become clear to all who have eyes. Even if you are able to conceal her pregnancy, when she gives birth, you will not be able to deny that you are responsible, because the child will undoubtedly resemble you, and that will expose your guilt. What will happen to your reputation then? You have no choice but to murder her and bury her before anyone knows of this. So he killed her and buried her and covered her grave with a large stone. Soon thereafter, her brothers returned, and when they asked about their sister, the pious man said, she died and I buried her. The brothers mourned their sister, thanked the pious man, and returned to their home. That night, they all went to sleep, and in their dreams a man came to each of them. And that man said that your sister has not died, but rather the pious man from the children of Israel has killed her, and she is buried in such and such a place. So they went, and sure enough, they found their sister's corpse buried, and they found that she had been murdered. So they headed toward the house of the pious man. And the shaitan came to his hermitage and said, I am the one who got you to fornicate with her, to murder her. And I am the only one who can save you now. I'm the only one. I know everything. I did everything. And if you want to be safe, you have to listen to me. Will you obey me? The man said, yes, I will obey you. I want to get out of this predicament. So Shaitan, he said, prostrate before me and I will save you from them. Just usjud li sajdatan wahida. Just one sajda and I'll save you. And the man, he did it because he wanted to be saved. And as soon as he did it, the Shaitan stepped aside, the door, the men burst open. They burst through the door, I'm sorry. And they killed the pious man. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, فَكَانَ عَاقِبَتَهُمَا أَنَّهُمَا فِي النَّارِ خَالِدَيْنِ فِيهَا وَذَلِكَ جَزَاءُ الظَّالِمِينَ. He says the end of both of them, Satan and the man he deceived, will be that they will enter the fire, dwelling therein forever. Such is the recompense of the wrongdoers. So, Ada Ujal, I just want to mention a few lessons that we can take away from this qissa, from this story, as it relates to how the Shaitan practices enmity against Adam and his progeny. So the first thing we need to pay attention to, Ya Ahl al-Masjid, O people who come to the mosque, people who try to worship Allah and fear Allah. The first lesson we get is that Satan, he targets the irreligious people. Huh? He targets the religious people. He targets you. He targets the people who pray, the people who fast, the people who read Quran, the people who make dhikr, the people who come to the masjid. He targets you. He's not so concerned about the people who go to the bars and the people who go to the strip clubs and the people who drink wine and the people who fornicate. He doesn't target them as much. Why? Because they're already in his army. He doesn't have to recruit them. He's after you. And you notice in the qissa, it said that the man was pious and people sought him from far and wide. He was guiding the people to the deen. Not only was he practicing the deen, he was guiding other people. Telling people, no, don't worship it like this, worship him like this. Oh, don't offer your prayer like that. Oh, you should pray. He was bringing people, increasing their iman, making them stronger believers. The Shaitan fa'aradahu. So he targeted him. Arada and yuhwiyahu. He wanted to what? Lead him astray. Why? Why do you think that is? Why does the Shaitan care if this guy worships Allah? Why do you think? He targeted him. You know what Umar used to say, radiallahu anhu? He used to say, Zallatu alim, Zallatu alim. He used to say, the mistake of a scholar will cause generations of people to go in the wrong direction. You guys understand that? That basically, when the religious people make a mistake, other people follow their bad example. Why? Because they're the religious people. They're the people look up to. You guys see that? So when they make a mistake, other people will follow. So the Shaitan is saying to himself, I can kill many birds with one stone. People lose faith in religion when they see the religious people do the wrong thing. You guys see that? The Shaitan understands this better than we understand it. So he targets you, targets the religious people. He wants to see you fail, because when you fail, people will lose faith in religion, the religious people. They're all fakers, they're all hypocrites. Why bother? That's what people will say. Also, people will follow their bad example. Either because they deem it good, it must be good because the religious people are doing it. You guys see that? And you see this with the Christians all the time. So Christians, they'll do things. And then when they're called, taken to task on it, they'll say, oh, well, this prophet, he coveted. He coveted the wife of the commander of his army. They'll say, this prophet did it. And they'll say, this prophet became so drunk, he committed an abomination. He committed profanity. That's what they'll say. And then they'll say, they are our role models for acceptable behavior. So if they did it, it must be okay to do it. They consider that model behavior because, according to them, it's a lie, but according to them, these prophets did these things. Or they use it as a justification for evil. And we hear this all the time. So for example, you tell someone, hey, brother, you can't pray with your elbows on the ground. right? So you'll see people, they'll prostrate like this. So the elbows on the ground. I said, brother, you can't do that. The Prophet prohibited that. And what's one of the first things people will say? I saw Sheikh so-and-so. Or Sheikh so-and-so saw me, he didn't say anything. People say that all the time. They use what the religious people do as a justification for their own evil. That so-and-so did it, I saw him do it, so it's okay for me to do it. It's acceptable for me to do it. Or, in the case of, like I said, the Christians, they'll say, for example, these prophets did these bad things, and they were prophets. So what do you expect from ordinary people like us? So this is one of the main reasons why the shaitan is targeting the religious people, Another lesson we get from the story is that no matter how pious you are, do not be fooled by your piety into believing, do not be fooled by your piety into believing that you are impervious to Satan. That the shaitan, he can't get me. I'm too pious. And sometimes it's not us saying that explicitly, but saying it implicitly. That we don't guard ourselves against the shaitan, and by not guarding ourselves is if we're saying, I'm good. Shaitan can't touch me. So we can't, no matter how pious we are, we can never allow ourselves to believe that we're impervious. Number 3, the devil often targets the religious people through wickedness. Through wickedness? Through goodness. The shaitan targets the religious people through goodness, meaning he encourages them to do good, or what appears to be good, in order to trick them into doing something bad without realizing it, or only realizing it when it's too late. Ibn al-Jawzi rahimahullah ta'ala, he said, إِنَّ الشَّيْطَانِ يَفْتَحُ لِلْعَبْدِ 99 بَابًا مِنْ أَبْوَابِ الْخَيْرِ لِيُدْرِكَ بِهِ بَابًا وَاحِدًا مِنْ أَبْوَابِ الشَّرِّ. He said, indeed, Satan opens for a committed individual, a religious person. Shaitan will do what? He'll open for him 99 doors from the doors of good. The shaitan will actually encourage you to do what? Do good. If he thinks that gradually by encouraging you to do good, he can make you do what? Do something evil. And there's examples of this. And you see this all the time. You see people, for example, they abandon certain obligations or highly recommended practices in the name of taking care of their family. So you have people, for example, who they will take a job that prevents them from praying on time. They know I'm not going to be able to pray on time, but they take the job. And they justify in their mind, I have to take care of my family. All of you are shepherds, and each one of you is going to be asked about his flock. So they take the job, caring only about this, although ignoring their religious obligations is more, fulfilling their religious obligations is more important than what? Than this. And if they fulfill their obligations, Allah will take care of their family. Or they'll convince themselves that, for example, I'm going to avoid doing this thing that I'm supposed to do because I want to avoid being extreme. And this happens a lot with parents. So, for example, parents don't wake their children up for prayer because they don't want to seem that they're too hard on their children, right? A mother may not make her daughter wear hijab even though the daughter's become pubescent because I don't want to be too hard, I don't want to seem extreme. And so the shaitan will make us, convince us that, look, you're doing good because you're being moderate. But in reality, you're doing what? You're doing something wrong because you're not fulfilling your religious obligations toward your child, which is waking up for prayer and to making them cover and all those things. Another way that the shaitan gets us to do evil by getting us to do good is through what? Innovations. This is very common. That the shaitan will make us do something that we think will draw us close to Allah and we have no basis for it. Our intention is to do good, but the shaitan is using good, the desire to do good, to get us to do evil. Because there are few things which are more evil than al-bid'ah, than innovation. Very few things that are more evil than al-bid'ah, to the point that scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and others have said that al-bid'ah, innovations, are more beloved to the shaitan then al-ma'asi shahwaniyah, then the sins of desires. And the reason why they said is because when a person commits al-bid'ah, they don't repent because they think they're doing something good. But when a person does something, for example, drinks alcohol or gets into drugs or abandons prayer, they realize they're doing something bad, and ultimately, inshallah, they'll repent. But another thing that we learn from the Aether is that Satan is patient. He's patient. He didn't come to the monk immediately, or the pious person, and say, Ukfur, disbelieve in Allah. That wouldn't have worked. He had to do what? He had to chip away, chip away, chip away, chip away. And he was patient. He didn't rush. Patient. Got him to agree to be a caretaker for the girl. Once he got him to agree, slowly chipped away. Take the food to her door and then leave. Take the food to her door, step to the gate, wait to see if she comes out and gets it. When she comes out and gets it, say hello and then leave. Well, don't just stop at hello. Talk to her a little bit because her brothers are far away. She has no family. Okay, don't stand at the gate. Go to the door. Right? Sit on the porch and talk to her for a while. Okay? Stand in the doorway. Don't go inside, but stand in the door. Gradually, just chip, 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 chipping away. Shaitan is patient. So if the shaitan is patient, that means we have to be what? Even more patient. More patient in the obedience of Allah. More patient in resisting the disobedience of Allah. Another thing that we get from the Aether is that the shaitan, when he starts with you, he starts with the big sins, right? When the shaitan starts with you, he targets you. He starts with the big sins, right? No, he starts with what? The small sins. He starts with the small sins, small sin, small sin, bigger, a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger, until he gets to the bigger sins, and then to what? The biggest sin. See that? Took him from stand in the doorway and talk to her, to sleep with her, to murder her, to what? Prostrate to shaitan. You guys see that? That's how the shaitan does. So what that teaches you is that we're not supposed to be the people who focus our attention on the size or lack thereof of the sin. And some of the early Muslims, they used to say, لا تنظر إلى صغر المعصية بل انظر إلى عظمة or عظمة من تعصي. He used to say, don't focus your attention on the size of the sin. People say this all the time. Oh, it's just a minor sin. It's not that big of a deal. Come on, man. It's just a minor sin. Don't focus on that. Focus your attention on the greatness of the one you're sinning against. That's where your attention should be. Just focus on the fact that it's a sin, not the size of the sin. When you focus too much on the size of it, you belittle it, and then you what? You entertain it, you engage in it. Now, from the lessons is one of the ways the shaitan tricks people, particularly the religious people, is by making them conceited. One of the ways that the shaitan tricks the religious people is by making them conceited, full of themselves, and causing them to forget to be sincere, and that everything they do, they should do for Allah and to please Allah. Not what? For themselves, or to promote themselves, or to make themselves feel good about themselves, or to give a perception of themselves, a desirable perception of themselves. Walaikum salam. When the shaitan finally got the monk to be intimate with the girl, what did he tell him? What did he tell the man? And the girl became pregnant. What did he say? Murder. Okay, but why though? So what did he tell him to make him say, yeah, I got to do this?
He said murder.
Ha! Say it, Hamza.
Your reputation.
Your reputation. What are people going to think? What are people going to say? All these people have been coming far and wide to ask. They're not going to ask you for anything. And they're going to talk about you. And say, oh, remember the guy we used to get fatwa from? Oh, he did such and such and so and so. You got to protect your reputation. So at that point, it became about Allah or it became about who? It became about him and about the people and what the people were going to say and how they want to perceive him. It became, instead of an Allah-centered relationship, it became what? A self-centered. It's about me and what people are going to think about me. And so this is how the shaitan gets a lot of religious people without them realizing it. That they're so worried about perception that they don't do what's right. They're so worried about how people are going to perceive them that they don't do the right thing. And so what we need to do all the time is always bring it back to who? Allah. And if he brought it back to Allah, it's like, forget about my reputation. I don't want to get in trouble with Allah. I'm already in deep enough, I'm already in hot enough water. I don't want no more trouble from Allah. So I'm going to accept, I'm going to take my lumps, whatever they are, and I'm going to stop here and not continue to go further. But no, because he cared so much about how he was going to be perceived, he went beyond fornicating to what? To murder and to what? To shirk, the greatest sin. To preserve himself, even when the shaitan said, I can save you. Prostrate to me. It's about what? Saving my dunya instead of saving my what? Saving my what? My deen. You guys see that? It became about saving his dunya instead of saving his deen. This is how the shaitan is going to get us. Worrying too much about what? About what people are going to say and think and so on and so forth. Always bring it back. Take a step back. Why am I doing this? And the Prophet ﷺ said, this is the heart of deen when he said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Actions are judged by intentions. وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. Always, Abd'Llah, always bring it back to what? Intentions. Ikhlas and niyyah. Purifying your intention, making it for Allah's sake. But last but not least from the lesson, is that this Aether underscores the importance of taking shaitan as an enemy. And how do we do that? There's a few steps. One, being humble and acknowledging our vulnerability. I can be had by the shaitan. You have to believe that. And it's not just believing it explicitly. Most of us, if you're asked, hey, you think the shaitan can get over on you? Yeah. But our practice. How does your practice show that you think the shaitan can't get over on you? Well, you don't do anything. You're not doing anything to basically fortify yourself. It gives the impression, yeah, I got this. Like, second of all, we have to learn how to recognize the voice of Satan. So when Shaitan told him, hey, you're in trouble. Look at this predicament. What are people going to say? It behooved him to say, this is not what? This is not the voice of an angel. You guys see that? Kill her. Bury her. This is not the voice of what? We have to learn how to recognize the voice of Satan. Now, it's not always easy. So when the shaitan came to him and said, hey, don't just put the food down at the front door and make her walk across the courtyard. That's not as easy to recognize as what? Kill her. Steal. Lie. Cheat. When you hear that, you have to be able to recognize that that's who? Shaitan. The shaitan. That's how you defend yourself against the shaitan. And then next one, refusing to listen to him. When you recognize the shaitan's voice, you refuse to what? You refuse to listen. And last but not least, constantly seeking refuge with Allah from the shaitan's whisper. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَقُلْ أَعُوذُ بِكَ مِنْ حَمَزَاتِ الشَّيَاطِينِ وَأَعُوذُ بِكَ أَنْ يَحْضُرُونَ. And say, O servants of Allah, I seek refuge with Allah from the whisperings of the devil. And I seek refuge in you that they would what? They would come to me. That they would come to me and they would surround me and they would continue to what? Push me in the wrong direction. And constantly in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us whenever we are confronted by the shaitan, we're not supposed to basically think that we can take him. Rather, we're supposed to realize we can't take him without Allah's help, so we constantly do what? Seek refuge in Allah from the shaitan. Every time you see Allah mention the shaitan, when he mentions, for example, the other threats, he'll tell you, do this, do this. He'll give you things that you can do to protect yourself from those other threats. Whenever he mentions the shaitan, he says, Pt.7. Seek refuge with Allah. As I tell you, you can't. You don't have a chance against shaitan except with Allah's aid. So with that, that's what I wanted to say in commentary on the Aether. And before I open the floor if there's any questions or comments, I just want to mention a few things on Ujala. The first thing is that this week, the 9th and 10th of Muharram will occur this week. Now, some of the calendars have Tuesday as the 9th, which is tomorrow, and Wednesday is the 10th. And other calendars have Wednesday and Thursday, Wednesday being the 9th and Thursday being the 10th. And it is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ that we fast both the 9th and the 10th of Ashura, the 10th being, the 9th and 10th of Muharram, and the 10th day being Ashura. And so mark your calendars to be on the safe side. It's probably best if we fast, because of the difference in the calendars, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, to make sure that we get the 9th and the 10th. But even if you don't get the 9th, the main day you want to get is the 10th, because that's the day of Ashura, and that's the day the Prophet said, أحتسب على الله أنه يكفر السنة التي قبله. He said, whoever fasts the day of Ashura, I expect that Allah will expiate his sins from the previous year. The whole year is going to be wiped clean for one day of what? One day of fasting. And so we can't miss out on this. If you can fast, if you're not ill, or you don't have a reason why you can't fast, you should what? You should fast on that day. The next thing, the Sheikh, he wanted me to make sure that I mentioned that every Saturday we go out to the flea market. We've been doing that for the past few months. And he really wanted to encourage some of the members of the community to participate and to commit themselves to participating on Saturdays if you can. Give one Saturday a month. Give one Saturday a quarter, you know. But he'd like for some of the community members to also be a part of this great work. He particularly would encourage if it were a couple, a husband and a wife team that came out. We've had some members of the community who've come out, and they have been very effective, in fact, and they've actually brought some additional energy. So sometimes when there's more of us out there, we kind of support each other, the energy goes up, and the interactions are more plentiful and they're more fruitful. And definitely there was a day where a few sisters came out, and really it just elevated what we were doing. There was more interactions, there was more material given out, and so again, we just encourage you if you can. And last but not least, Maghrib continues to inch back and become earlier. And we had, for a period, had changed. We'd initially started at 7:15. That was our time, our starting time for the classes on Monday. And then we went to 7:30 because Maghrib was getting later. But now Maghrib is now getting a lot earlier. So inshallah ta'ala, beginning next week, we'll start at 7 p.m. We'll start at 7 p.m. sharp. And that'll give us maybe an hour and 10, hour and 15 minutes solid to have our discussions before we offer prayer. Are there any questions, comments, or critiques before we close? Tafadali.
I have a quick question. You were saying in the lecture, and I thought about it. With Shaitan, what's his status? Because it says La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, but he's disobedient. So what is he considered?
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls the shaitan a disbeliever in the Quran. So he says, Aba wastakbar wa kana min al-kafirin. Says he defied Allah, he rebelled, and he became arrogant, haughty in his rebellion, and thus became from the disbelievers. So for some people it is an ishkal, it is like problematic. They say, okay, the shaitan knows Allah. He knows Allah better than some of the believers. And he says, La ilaha illallah. And he says things like he said in this verse, Inni akhafullah. He says, I fear Allah, which is a type of iman. He says, okay, so how do we reconcile between the fact that Allah called him disbeliever, but he's displaying all these aspects of iman? What we have to remember is that iman, if it is nullified by a nullifier, is like no iman. And the shaitan nullified his iman with one of the nullifiers of faith, which is al-iba wal-istikbar, haughty, arrogant rebellion. So that's a type of disbelief. So that nullified his faith. It's just like a person who went and they make wudu. And then as soon as they turn from the sink, they pass wind. So now that wudu that they had is nullified. And they have to now turn again to the sink and make wudu again. Otherwise, their prayer won't be accepted. So the same thing with shaitan. He had faith. And then he nullified it with istiqbal. And as a result, no faith. And Allah after that cursed him, such that he will never repent. So he'll never turn back to the sink and repeat his wudu. Any other questions going once? Tafadhal, Nasr. Are you going to lead the prayer tonight? Because see, you didn't do it for us last time. I kind of felt a certain type of way. Tafadhal, Shaykh. I'm just joking. No.
Okay. So the thing was about, you said the shaitan, he says, inni akhafullah rabbil alameen. Could that be part of his deception?
That's what Al-Qurtubi said. Al-Qurtubi said he doesn't fear Allah. He doesn't fear Allah. He just said that as part of his deception. Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Al-Qurtubi says something like that in his tafsir. Exactly. Along the lines of what you just said. That the fear that he has is a fake fear. A fear that is useful. A fear that is somehow advantageous to him, but not a fear that's legitimate, a real, genuine fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if he feared Allah, he would repent. He would recant. He wouldn't have been haughty and arrogant in the first place. Jazakallah khair. Taib, any other? Going once? Going twice? Tafadhali.
The story that you were telling, where can I find this? Is it like
That particular story has been mentioned by the commentators, the Quranic commentators, and they mention it under the ayah from Surah Al-Hashr. Surah Al-Hashr is the 59th surah, and that ayah that they mention under is the 16th ayah. So 59, 16. If you look at the commentaries, for example, of Al-Tabari, Al-Qurtubi, Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir is available in English, like about 7 to 10 volumes of it. So that one you should find the Aether in that version or in that translation. Yeah. The primary thing for Ashura is fasting. It's not like, for example, Arafah, where it's a day of qiyam, a day of dhikr, a day of dua, no matter where you are in the earth. Ashura, I'm not sure if there's any specific deeds that a person is recommended to do besides fasting. Yeah. But again, if a person can't fast, they can have the niyyah to fast. And a lot of times we get the reward for doing things that we didn't do simply because of the strong intention that we had. Now basically, there were people at the time of the Prophet ﷺ who wanted to go out for jihad, but they didn't have any provisions. And they got the reward that the people who went out got because they really sincerely wanted to go. So the best thing a person can do if they can't do the deed is intend with all their heart or regret with all their heart that they can't do the deed. And they may achieve through their intention what they don't achieve through the actual doing of the action. Like any other questions, comments, or critiques? Going once, going twice. So 7 p.m. next week, inshallah ta'ala. And fasting, bi'idhnillah, tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday, or at least the 10th, depending on what calendar you follow. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.